All right, good morning. We are studying questions Jesus asked, and we are in the book of Matthew. Make sure I got this right because I wrote it down. Sometimes I forget to write it down, and if I don't, that's trouble. Matthew 11. We covered the questions in chapter 10 last week. Just going in order through these. So we're in Matthew 11. And the question here comes in, well, there's several of these. And I was going to look, let me find the passage here in my parallel. Let's see, I think it's different. Well, did I go to Matthew? I'm still learning to use this new software or new app that I got. So, well, it's not. I thought it was. But verse 7, there are a series of questions here. Really, 7 through 9. And so it says there, beginning in verse 7, as they departed, Jesus began to say unto the multitudes concerning John, talking about John the Baptizer, John the Baptist, we often call him, What went ye out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken with the wind? But what went ye out for to see? A man clothed in soft raiment? Behold, they that wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. But what went ye out for to see? A prophet? Yea, I say unto you, and more than a prophet. And then to get a little bit more of the context there, we'll just read on. For this is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send my messenger before thy face, which shall prepare thy way before thee. Verily I say unto you, among them that are born of women, there hath not risen a greater than John the Baptist. Notwithstanding, he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John, and if you will receive it, this is Elias, or Elijah, which was for to come. He that hath ears to hear, let him hear. So, there's our question, or again, in this case, series of questions. What did you go out to see? And so he's going to, of course, expound on that. But Jesus asked this question in the context of speaking about John. And in some sense, it wouldn't hurt us to back up to even to verse 1, because Jesus had, verse 1 says, made an end of commanding his 12 disciples, departed thence to teach and to preach in their cities. Now, when John had heard in the prison the works of Christ, he sent 2 of his disciples. Now, John has been put in prison by Herod. So there's John in prison. We've talked about this at length before, and I've told you before, this study that we're doing now is based on one that Papaw, my father-in-law, put together a few years ago. Just going through each question that Jesus asked, but he also, I don't remember which one came first, but he also put together a study of questions people asked Jesus. And so if we were doing that study, and maybe we will at some point, this would be one of those. Because John, he sends 2 of his disciples to ask Jesus a question. Art thou he that should come, verse 3, or do we look for another? And again, I think it was probably when we studied through the book of Matthew not too long ago, I believe it was on Wednesday nights, that we talked in depth about that. And, was John struggling a bit with his faith because here he is in prison and Jesus is not taking action to release him? And maybe John's sort of feeling a bit perplexed. I've been telling everybody you're the Christ. I believe it. I've been preparing the way, and I get put in prison and you're not doing anything. And not a disrespectful type of question, but a little bit of confusion. Like, hey, I don't understand what's going on here. And of course, Jesus answers, verse 4, or sends answer, Go and show John those things which you do hear and see. The blind receive their sight, lame walk, lepers are cleansed, deaf hear, dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them, and blessed is he whosoever shall not be offended in me. You know, people have had all kind of ideas as to exactly why John asked that question. Bottom line is we can't say for sure. It seems to me that the most logical answer would be that maybe he was struggling a little bit. Some people have said, oh no, John had full faith and he sent them with that question so that they would be, convicted and understand. Maybe. Again, we just don't know that for sure. But in that context, and I think the context here as you get into the questions Jesus asked, I think that lends us to believe that perhaps, in fact, John was struggling a little bit, and that was the reason for the question, because now Jesus is it's almost like he wants to reinforce to John, and it's kind of, he's going to brag on John a little bit, or a lot, really. And so he starts to ask these questions pertaining to John the Baptizer. Well, he says, what did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft raiment? Then he asks, did you go out to see a prophet? Of course, he says, yea, I say unto you, and more than a prophet. And I forgot verse 7 when he says, what did you go out to see? A reed shaken with the wind. Of course, John was no reed shaken with the wind. We could spend some time studying about John. He was bold, and he was fearless in his preaching. In fact, it ends up literally costing him his life, because why was he in prison at this time? He told Herod of his wife Herodias. He had his brother Philip's wife. He said, it's not lawful for you to have her. And so he was put in prison for that. But Herod was loath to do anything more. And again, the Bible doesn't give us a ton of detail on that. There's a lot of speculation when you start reading commentaries and such. But the Bible just doesn't tell us for sure. But he was kind of content just to have John in prison. It's kind of like, well, he had shown his authority over John, I guess. He felt content with that. But of course, there's this birthday party, essentially, and the daughter of Herodias comes and she dances, and Herod gets so carried away. You just ask for whatever you want, up to half the kingdom, and I'll give it. And he says this before all those guests, and her mother counsels her. You asked for the head of John the Baptist. So she did. And the text tells us Herod was sorry, yet for the oath's sake, and those that were there. In other words, he said it in front of everybody, so he was going to be left with egg on his face if he didn't follow through. So he did. He sent somebody, they behead John, bring the head back, and it's really a gruesome thing to even to think about. And yet that's what this lady wanted, and she wants it delivered to her. Again, I can't say exactly why, but presumably for, hey, I want to see that head and know this guy has been killed. But be that as it may, he ends up being killed for his conviction, his faithfulness to the message that God had given him, and to the truth of God's word. Certainly was no reed shaken with the wind. What did you go out to see? He says next there in verse 8, a man clothed in soft raiment. Well, what does the Bible tell us about John and his clothing? Camel hair, leather girdle. I've never worn anything made of camel hair, but I suspect it's probably not the most comfortable thing. I have seen something made out of camel's hair. If you go to the Biblical History Center in LaGrange, there's a camel hair tent there. I think it's camel and goat hair, as I recall. Kind of different ones woven together, and I don't remember which is which, but there's a darker color and a lighter color, and one's one, one's the other. But I tell you what, I've felt of that material. It doesn't feel like it'd be something comfortable to wear. But John was not somebody just living luxuriously in a palace, is the idea here. He didn't just kick back and take it easy. He's out in the wilderness. And so, he says, did you go out to see some pretty boy? No, that's not John. He was not a reed shaking with the wind. He was not somebody that was just, kick back, taking it easy, trying to live off the people or something like that. And eating locusts and wild honey. Yeah, we often talk about, a lot of the young folks can tell you from Bible classes, they just, that sticks with you. He's eating locusts and wild honey. The wild honey doesn't sound too bad. Locust, I don't know. Maybe he dipped them in the honey and that helped the taste. I don't know. But, he was not just somebody living luxuriously. And then he says, what did you go out to see? A prophet. Yea, I say unto you, and more than a prophet. He certainly was a prophet. He went to prepare the way for the Messiah. That was his mission, and of course he fulfilled that. Numerous passages that talk about that. There's a man sent from God whose name was John, the book of John, verse 6 of chapter 1. And it's in the book of John, written by John the apostle, but he's talking about John the baptizer. There was a man sent from God whose name was John, talking about John the Baptist. He was a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, verse 11. Jesus is going to quote here from Malachi. In fact, somebody want to read Malachi 3:1? Somebody grab that, please, and we'll look at a couple of verses there at Malachi. And if you have cross references in your Bible, you probably have a cross reference to this.
Behold, I send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before thee. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant whom you desire, behold, he comes, says Jehovah of hosts.
All right, and go ahead, Bob, while you're there, please, and read Malachi 4:5.
Behold, I will send you Elijah, the prophet, before the great and terrible day of Jehovah comes.
All right, so Malachi 3:1 says, I will send my messenger. He'll prepare the way before me. And that's God speaking there, but he prepared the way for Jesus. So this is another one of those, numerous passages we could go to if we're talking about the deity of Christ, God in the flesh. But this is one of those because this is Jehovah speaking here. But he says he'll prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek shall suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant. And then, of course, Malachi 4:5, I'll send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. So he was, in fact, a prophet. He was fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy to prepare the way of the Messiah. And Jesus, well, let me say this before I make that point. I don't know that I had ever run across this, but every time I read about John and this reference to, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet there from Malachi 4:5. I remember there was a brother in Childersburg. I was preaching there, a good man, good brother, faithful to the church, and a good worker in the church. But he had a strange thing that he said to me, and I think it was after maybe a Q&A session one Sunday night. And he told me, he said, have you ever thought about this, Chad? He said, I believe that John was Elijah. Like God sent Elijah back. He said, think about it. He said, Elijah never died. Just went up into heaven. And God talks, so often about he's going to directly send John on this mission. And sometimes you hear something and you just kind of go, I don't think so. And so I said, yeah, I'm not sure about that. And he said, I believe. He said, you check that out. And I said, well, John was a messenger. He said, yeah, but God said he was going to send Elijah. And he says, and he went right here in the context of Matthew where, I just read it a second ago, verse 14, and if you will receive it, this is Elijah, which was for to come. I said, well, he came in the spirit and power of Elijah. And he said, well, now, Chad, Jesus said he was Elijah. So I said, all right, well, I'm going to take a look at that and see. I said, I don't know of anywhere else in the Bible you could say where there's any kind of concept of, what, he didn't use the word, but I said, you're essentially talking about reincarnation. And I said, that's just not something that's ever taught or seen in Scripture. He was adamant. He said, I'm convinced. Well, hold your spot there in Matthew 11. Turn over to Matthew 17. It's funny because I put this out on a list of preachers that next, I think it was the next day. I said, hey, just had a question and answer on John the Baptist, and I was talking about him coming in the spirit and power of Elijah, and I had a brother approach me, and basically he thinks that John is Elijah reincarnated. And I said, I don't know if I've ever run across this. How would you guys go about dealing with that? I said, it's just one of those things that I can't see it being the case, because it would be so unique to anything else you see in Scripture. So the brother mentioned Matthew 17. Look at verse 10. This is after the transfiguration. They're coming down from the mountain, verse 9. Jesus tells them, don't say anything until the Son of Man be risen from the dead. His disciples asked him, saying, why then say the scribes that Elias, that's if you got the King James, Elijah, other versions, must first come? And Jesus answered and said unto them, Elias truly shall first come and restore all things. But I say unto you that Elias has come already, and they knew him not, but have done unto him whatsoever they listed. Likewise also shall the Son of Man suffer of them. Then the disciples understood that he spake unto them of John the Baptist. Now, even with that, somebody might say, well, yeah, he's talking about John the Baptist, but he's... So we could go over to one more passage, and it's in John chapter 1. We saw verse 6, there's a man sent from God whose name was John. And so it gives some information there about John, and it goes on. You've got John's testimony concerning Christ. That's the heading I have in my Bible for beginning at verse 15. But drop to verse 19. And this is the record of John. When the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, who art thou? And he confessed and denied not, but confessed, I am not the Christ. And they asked him, what then? Art thou Elias? And he saith, I am not. Art thou that prophet? And he answered, no. Now, we've talked before, studying the book of John, the people in Jesus' time seemed to have some kind of confusion, many of the people at least, about, sometimes they would say, are you the Christ? Or are you that prophet? Moses said, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you like unto me, Deuteronomy 18. People were making a distinction between that prophet, and the Christ. They're one and the same. But so sometimes you'll see that in John. Sometimes people will say, oh, I believe Jesus is a prophet. Other people say, I think he's that prophet. Other people say, I think he's the Christ. Well, that prophet and the Christ are the same thing. But John says clearly, I am not Elijah. And of course they go on to ask, who art thou, that we may give an answer to them that sent us? What sayest thou of thyself? He said, I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as said the prophet Isaiah, if you got the old King James, Isaiah, in other words. So John makes it very clear he's not some reincarnation of Elijah, but he came in the spirit and in the power of Elijah. And that's the idea there when it says, Elijah is going to come before the Christ's face, or to prepare the way. Yes, sir.
I grew up a Catholic, and when I became a member of the church, I knew the Bible was very important. And so I took the Bible literally. Well, we should. But the passages that you brought in your presentation about John the Baptist, he is Elijah or he's not Elijah. And the passage in
Yeah, and that's a rule when you're studying the Bible and interpreting the Bible. We sometimes talk about hermeneutics, and that's just as Brother Billy Bland used to say, that's the CNN word for interpreting. When we talk about studying hermeneutics and interpreting the Bible, that's the rule. You interpret it literally unless there's something there that indicates, okay, this is to be taken figuratively. And there are some other rules that you can go into with that help us to understand that. But yeah, there are times, and you see it a lot in prophecy. And when you understand you're in a prophetic book, there will be a lot of figurative language. And sometimes, quite often, you'll see what we call apocalyptic language. The sun going dark and the moon turning to blood and stars falling from heaven and things like that are not literal, but it's symbolic of something. And usually apocalyptic language is symbolic of some kind of a changing of the guard, a fall of dignitaries or fall of powers, nations and things like that, to be replaced with something else. And so yeah, it's, you have to understand there, just like we talk in figurative language. I mean, we do this, I was going to say we do this all the time. There's a figure of speech. You know, we don't literally do it all the time, but we say things like that. Man, I had to wait in line all day today. I waited in line forever, and things like that. We do this frequently in our speech, and so the Bible often uses figures as well. And but I had never encountered that before talking to this brother, and so I studied through that. And when you put those passages together, you see it's a figure. He came as a figure of Elijah. He came in the spirit, the power of Elijah. And so I did want to mention that because sometimes people have asked about that. I've encountered it maybe once or twice since then, but that was, I've been at Bremen, 11 and a half years. So it was 11 and a half, 12 years ago or so, and I'd been preaching for a decent time, and I'd never run across that before. Yes, sir.
Your Wednesday night class, similar to what you're looking at now, you use the term the Bible does in the likeness of Melchizedek. It's the same. It's leading to some other event that will take place.
Right. Yeah, a priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. And again, you have people, and I had heard that before, but you have people that will say Melchizedek was a theophany. It was the second person of the Godhead before his incarnation. But there's nothing there really to support that. It's just talking about the likeness of the priesthood. It's a comparison. And of course, especially when you see a word like or as, something like that, you see that comparison. It's not necessarily something that is to be literal. So interesting points there. But I wanted to make that point before we go on and talk about the greatness of John. And I just want to mention that before we move on to our next question. The greatness of John, he was greater than any prophet. And Jesus talks about that, verse 11. Among them that are born of women, there's not risen a greater than John the Baptist. Notwithstanding, he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. John was a voice crying in the wilderness, chapter 3 of Matthew tells us. But he was more than just a voice. He was a man of boldness, conviction, and we just mentioned that with the situation there with Herod and his wife. You see details of that in Mark 6, 17 through 20. But what about this statement, he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he? What's he talking about there? Yeah, he's not taking anything away from John. And you see that. That's very obvious here in the context. But John lived and died under that old covenant. And we sometimes talk about the gospel age as being the full light. Sometimes I've heard old preachers years ago talk about, the twilight age of the Mosaic dispensation, living in the sunlight age, and kind of a play on words there, S-U-N, sunlight, but also S-O-N, sunlight. And John was not in the kingdom because he lived and died under the old law. The church was established later after his death. And so in that sense, we have greater blessing. Not say that, oh man, Jesus is ranking people on a totem pole or something. He's just saying there's greater blessings there. Bob, were you going to say something?
Sometimes parents bring their kids to the school, and after a period of time, teenagers could be mean, and they could really just make someone feel so bad. And it's true, the kid really does feel bad. Goes back home, and the parents reaffirm their love. You are somebody, and then the kid goes back the next day and gets beat up all over again. Now, we can relate to that, but adults are the same. When we have someone come to our congregation and haven't took a shower in 3 weeks or whatever, okay, or has absolutely no money, living in a tent in the woods somewhere, if that person is a member of the church, God is saying, in this passage, I believe, you are of great value.
Absolutely.
Just like that little kid that goes back to school, we go back to wherever our place in life is, and we need to remember that because we have God's word on that.
And I think that's an important point. He's showing the value of even those whom we might esteem least. And I do that with the air quotes because God loves us all equally. But how we might view somebody as least in the kingdom, he's better off in one sense than even John, as great as he was. And that's an encouraging thought. And that's Jesus telling us our value to him and to the Father. So great thoughts there. But anyway, series of questions there dealing with John the Baptizer. And so there's our questions from Matthew chapter 11. And so let's move on to Matthew chapter 12. Got a handful here. So to get the context, of course, our question is going to be really verses 3 and 4. It's one question, but it's a long question that is asked over 2 verses as we have it in our Bibles. But to get that question and get it in its context, Jesus is on the Sabbath day. They're going through the corn, is the way the King James puts it. And, I grew up, I didn't really grow up on a farm, but I grew up around a farm. My uncle had a farm, and they lived just down the road from us, and he always had lots of corn. He raised hogs, and so he would have feed corn, and then he would sometimes have sweet corn. And I remember a lot of times as a kid, we would, he learned that what he had to do was hide the sweet corn because people come along and they just steal it. So sometimes you just have acres and acres of feed corn, which you don't want to eat that. The hogs love it, but you don't want to eat it. And then in the middle of one of these big, huge patches, he'd plant about an acre or so of sweet corn. And he'd tell all the sisters, I think there were 4 or 5 sisters, and just my uncle, him and Granddaddy would tell the sisters and close family members, here's where you go, here's how you get to that. And it was, he let everybody in the family go and get all the corn, all the sweet corn they wanted. But I remember, we'd have to sometimes traipse out through this field to go get to the sweet corn patch. But I used to read this as a kid, and I pictured walking through the corn as a kid, and it just makes me laugh thinking about that, because that's not what it's talking about. It's talking about wheat, of course. But for some reason, the way the King James, in that time, they would have understood that to mean wheat. But for us, we kind of go, corn? I didn't know they ate corn. But and maybe they ate cornbread too. I don't know. But anyways, it's talking about wheat. So they began to, they're walking through the corn on the Sabbath day, the wheat field, and his disciples were an hungered and began to pluck the ears of corn, wheat, and to eat. So they're going, they might have been walking literally through the field, or they might have been walking, sometimes there'd be a path that would go through, and have a field over here, a field over there, and then the path just goes through it as you're going on your way. Either way, they're hungry, so they grab a few heads of grain, and but that's how you process wheat, is you take those heads of grain, it would dry out, and then you have to thresh it, And they had threshing instruments. You could also do that by hand, beating it, something that would, get the husk away and things like that. And then, the Bible often uses this illustration of the chaff being blown away by the wind. You'd have this almost feathery, dust-like chaff, and they would often, especially when they're threshing like large amounts of wheat, they would do this on a place that was kind of raised up, and where there, of course, a lot of the Palestine area has wind almost every day of the year, but they would get somewhere where the wind was unobstructed, and so when you get done threshing it with the sledge, something that, a lot of times they would have, if you're doing a lot of wheat, an animal is pulling this, looks kind of like a sled, but it might have pieces of rock embedded in it or something like that would help break off the husk, things like that. So you get all the stalks and stuff out of the way, you can get that, you scoop it up. Sometimes you have like a little slotted basket that they would thread it, and some of the pieces would fall through, but at some point they would take that and they just toss it up, and that chaff is just blown away. And so it was a very familiar sight and a very powerful illustration for people in that time. It talks about, the ungodly are not so in Psalm 1. Blessed is the man that walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, or sitteth in the seat of the scornful, standeth in the way of sinners. But his delight's in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. But then he talks about the ungodly. The ungodly are not so, but they're like the chaff which the wind driveth away. But here, these disciples of Jesus, they just grab a few heads of corn. Probably had already been, you could do this and be like, eating green peanuts or something, I guess. But it might very well have been that the grain had already been cut. They would cut it, gather it into bundles, and then set it out, and it would dry out. So they may have been just grabbing some off the bundles, but you could just rub it in your hand, and that gets the husk away, and you could just kind of hold it in your hand and blow the chaff away, and they're just eating some wheat right there just from the field. But it's the Sabbath day. I was asking my children the other night in Bible time. It was late. It was past bedtime, and so they were getting into bed, and they said, "Oh, Daddy, we didn't do Bible time. Can we do a quick Bible time?" And they get real spiritual when it's bedtime. I've noticed that. And they say, "Hey, look, we can't go to bed right now, Dad. We did not do Bible time." So I said, "Okay, I got a quick Bible time for you." I said, "What day of the week does the Bible record the most miracles of Jesus on?" And they said, the boys said, Sunday. And Paisley did too. I did it separately with them because they were already in their beds. And the boys said, Sunday. No, not Sunday. And they said, Friday? No. And they said, Saturday. You got it. And Paisley, she said Sunday. I said, no. Monday? No. Tuesday? No. We went through every day of the week, and she finally came to Saturday. She said, oh, got it. And I said, well, you weren't left with any other days of the week, dear. But when you read the miracles of Jesus, they're not always on the Sabbath, but that's the day we're specifically given more than any other day of the week. And I had an older preacher tell me one time, and I don't know, there might be something to it. He said, I sort of wonder if Jesus didn't do miracles on the Sabbath sometimes on purpose, just to make a point, because they would often try to accuse him of working on the Sabbath. Well, we've already seen that in one of our other questions. Well, here, it's not a miracle, but they're going through this field. The Pharisees saw it, verse 2 tells us, and they said unto him, Behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day. Don't you know it is the Sabbath day, and here you are out reaping, threshing, the very idea. Well, Jesus tells us right here in the context what they did was not wrong. I think you could hardly classify that as work on the Sabbath. And it again underscores something that we have said before. God didn't give the Sabbath law to try to constrain man in some way. He gave the Sabbath law for our good, because we need rest. And there's benefits in that, physically, emotionally, spiritually. But he said unto them, verse 3, and this is our question, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? They that were with him, how he entered into the house of God and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? But I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple. And he's going to go on to say, but if you had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. Now, first of all, there in verse 7, he calls the disciples there the guiltless. So they did no wrong here. But it is important to understand their implication is your disciples are breaking the law. Why aren't you doing something about it? And of course, the background for this is in Deuteronomy 23, 24, and 25, where the law would allow eating grain in another person's field. This is also not stealing. Some people have tried to say, well, Jesus is also, excusing their stealing. And what I'm getting at here is sometimes people try to use this passage and try to teach what is essentially situation ethics. They say, well, see, they were taking grain that wasn't theirs, and Jesus said that's no big deal. So there might be a situation where you need to take something. Yes, that's the passage there, Deuteronomy 23, 24, and 25. But that's talking about you can go through a person's field and get some grain, but you can't go and like put a threshing instrument to it. In other words, if you're walking through a field and you're hungry, it's kind of like, if your neighbor, they're passing by, man, you got a big cluster of grapes there, you might grab a handful of them or something and eat a few. Well, we shouldn't have a problem with that. But now if he's out there with his, 5-gallon bucket, now it's like, whoa, man, what are you doing? You hadn't asked permission or anything. So, in that sense, they didn't. Aaron mentioned, I had it, where did I? Yeah, it's somewhere in that region. I thought I had it in my notes, but I'm not seeing it. Maybe I didn't write that down. But yeah, the old law allowed for that. You could gather some as you walk through or whatever, but you don't, start harvesting. And also it said when you go and you harvest your field, don't go over it twice. Why? Well, that left some behind for the poor, the orphans. And you see this in the book of Ruth. Ruth is going to go, and she's going behind the reapers of Boaz. And of course, Boaz, he takes notice of her, and he starts telling the reapers, hey, leave some extra. Drop a few on purpose, because I want to make sure she has plenty to eat. The law also told them when you reap your field, you round the corner, and don't go back and reap that where you just kind of cut the corner there and round it off. Don't go back and get all that in that little corner. Again, that was for the poor. So, again, they're not doing anything wrong in that sense. But to talk about this reference that Jesus makes to David, it's the passage is 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 6. David, he's on the run from Saul. So he comes to this place called Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech is, he's kind of uneasy about this, and David, says, well, I'm on business. I don't have a sword or anything. The king's business required haste. And so he says, but boy, we're hungry. There's no common bread, though, he says, verse 4, 1 Samuel 21. There is hallowed bread. And so David ends up eating that. And again, a lot of times people look at this and they say, well, see, Jesus is teaching that in that situation, what they did was okay. And I don't see that at all here. Jesus is not saying what David did was okay. I like the way one fellow put it. He called what David did not, where is it, verse 4, which was not lawful. So he calls what David did not lawful. And so instead of a case of situation ethics, as this fellow says, it appears to be more of a case where the master is saying to his listeners, you're inconsistent. You give David a pass. Why? Well, because they just revered David. You give David a pass on what he did, which was wrong, yet you're all over my disciples when they did something that is not, in fact, wrong. And so he's saying your heart is not right. This is cronyism. Years ago, there was a church that was, man, they were on a crusade against apologetics press. They had some axe to grind against apologetics press. It was silly. It was much ado about nothing, and it was so inconsistent. But they were saying, well, people cannot support apologetics press. You cannot fellowship them and all this type of stuff. And it was so funny because this was back when the email lists were popular. Some guy gets on a list and he asks a question, what do y'all think about a church that has apologetics press tracts out in their tract rack and stuff? And they said, well, I would go, I'd speak to the leadership, I would talk to them, I would point out their inconsistency, I would rebuke them, and blah, blah, blah. And then he answered back and he said, well, this was at such and such Church of Christ, that it was one of the ones that had been on the crusade against apologetics press. And he said, I think that shows you, brethren, you're not being consistent. That's exactly what these people were doing. Oh, they love David. He's their hero, so he gets a free pass. But they're out to criticize Jesus, and so they try to nitpick something that was not wrong in itself. So giving David a pass on something he did that was in fact wrong. The apostles, the disciples, what they did was not, but they're still trying to say that it was. Jesus said what they did, they were guiltless, and we can take that to the bank. We know that what they did was not wrong. So it's not a case of situation ethics. He's pointing out their inconsistency. Well, we'll pick up, Lord willing, next week and look at the follow-up question here from Matthew 12:5 about the priests and their work on the Sabbath day. And the interesting point that Jesus makes there. I wish we had time to cover that now. We're just out of time. Thank y'all very much for your attention. We'll pick up there, Lord willing, next week.